At 8:26 p.m. on December 13, 2003, two trembling hands emerged from a cramped underground hole near the Iraqi village of Ad-Dawar. What followed was a voice that once commanded absolute fear across the Middle East, now reduced to desperate pleading. "My name is Saddam Hussein. I'm the president of Iraq, and I want to negotiate." But there would be no negotiations, no mercy, no escape. This was the final chapter of a man who has spent 30 years systematically destroying every bridge, betraying every ally, and turning the entire world into his enemy. The spider hole wasn't just his hiding place, it was his grave, dug by decades of unthinkable brutality and catastrophic arrogance that made staying hidden impossible. Disclaimer: this video contains accounts of war crime and extreme violence. The roots of Saddam's downfall stretch back to his brutal rise to power. Born into poverty in 1937, Hussein clawed his way to the top through a combination of ruthless violence and calculated betrayal. His early involvement with the CIA-backed Ba'ath Party in the 1950s should have been a warning sign. A young man willing to assassinate his own prime minister was never going to play by anyone's rules but his own. By 1979, when Saddam seized absolute power, he had already established a terrifying pattern. On July 22, 1979, just days after becoming president, he orchestrated one of the most chilling displays of political theater in modern history. In a packed auditorium filled with 400 government officials, Saddam calmly smoked a cigar as he read out the names of 68 traitors. One by one, these men were dragged away to their deaths, while their colleagues sat frozen in terror, unsure whether they would be next. 22 were executed immediately, their bodies left as a message to anyone who dared to oppose the new regime. This wasn't just brutality, it was systematic paranoia elevated to state policy. Saddam trusted no one, not even his closest allies. He created 5 separate intelligence agencies whose primary job was to spy on each other, ensuring that no single person could accumulate enough power to challenge him. Every government position was filled with relatives from his hometown of Tikrit, creating a close circle of power that would ultimately become his prison. But Saddam's most catastrophic mistake was his embrace of chemical warfare as a tool of political control. When the Iran-Iraq War erupted in 1980, what began as a territorial dispute over the Shah al-Arab waterway quickly escalated into something more sinister. As Iranian forces began pushing back Iraqi troops, Saddam made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He authorized the use of chemical weapons. The world watched in horror as sulfur mustard gas burned through Iranian soldiers' skin, leaving thousands blind and disfigured. But Saddam didn't stop at military targets. On March 16, 1988, Iraqi aircraft dropped a cocktail of sarin, VX nerve gas, and mustard gas on the Kurdish town of Halabja. The images that emerged were apocalyptic. Children lying dead in the streets next to their mothers, families frozen in their final moments of agony. Over 5,000 civilians died that day, with 10,000 more left permanently disabled. These weren't the actions of a rational leader protecting his nation. They were the war crimes of a man who had lost all connection to human decency. The international community's horrified reaction should have been Saddam's wake-up call. Instead, he doubled down, using chemical weapons in over 350 separate attacks. Each deployment was another step towards his inevitable reckoning with the world. Saddam's fatal miscalculation came in August 1990 when he invaded Kuwait. This wasn't just another border skirmish, it was a direct challenge to the global order that the United States had spent decades constructing. In a single night, Saddam transformed himself from a useful regional strongman into America's most wanted enemy. The invasion revealed the true scope of Saddam's delusions. He genuinely believed that his ragtag military could stand against a coalition of 42 nations led by the world's only superpower. When Operation Desert Storm began in January 1991, Iraqi forces were obliterated in just 100 hours of ground combat. But instead of accepting defeat, Saddam retreated into an increasingly fantastical narrative where every humiliation was actually a victory. As his troops fled Kuwait in chaos, Saddam ordered them to set fire to over 700 oil wells, creating an environmental catastrophe that blackened the skies for months. This wasn't military strategy, this was the tantrum of a man who would rather destroy everything than admit defeat. The image of Saddam as a regional strongman was replaced by an unstable dictator willing to commit environmental terrorism out of spite. The 1990s saw Saddam trapped in a web of international sanctions that slowly strangled his regime. But rather than seeking reconciliation, he spent these years plotting revenge against those who had humiliated him. In 1993, Iraqi intelligence operatives were caught attempting to assassinate former President George H.W. Bush during his visit to Kuwait. The plot involved a car that would have killed not just Bush, but dozens of innocent civilians. This wasn't diplomacy, it was international terrorism. The assassination attempt revealed that Saddam had learned nothing from his defeats. Instead of trying to rebuild his shattered nation, he was wasting resources on elaborate revenge fantasies. When the plot was exposed, any remaining sympathy for Iraq's suffering under sanctions evaporated. Saddam has confirmed the world's worst fear about his character. Meanwhile, his paranoia was consuming his own inner circle. His son-in-law, Hussein Kamal, who had overseen Iraq's weapons programs, fled to Jordan in 1995, taking with them detailed evidence of Iraq's chemical and biological weapons development. When Kamal was lured back to Iraq with promises of forgiveness, Saddam had him murdered within days. The message was clear: loyalty meant nothing, blood meant nothing, only absolute submission would be tolerated. After September 11, 2001, Saddam made his most catastrophic error in judgment. Instead of recognizing that America's tolerance for potential threats had evaporated overnight, he continued playing the same dangerous games that had sustained his regime for decades. When UN weapons inspectors returned to Iraq, Saddam engaged in elaborate deception campaigns that convinced the world he was hiding something terrible. But this wasn't the 1980s anymore. America was no longer interested in containing threats, it was eliminating them. Saddam's history of chemical weapons use, his attempted assassination of a former president, and his track record of unpredictable aggression had made a perfect storm of suspicion. The tragic irony is that by 2003, Iraq likely possessed no significant weapons of mass destruction, but Saddam's decades of deception, brutality, and betrayal had created such a cloud of suspicion that no one believed his denials. He had literally lied his way to the gallows. When American forces invaded Iraq in March 2003, they weren't just toppling a government, they were hunting down one of the world's most wanted men. Saddam's elaborate preparations for this moment revealed both his cunning and his ultimate isolation. He had constructed dozens of underground bunkers, stockpiled millions of dollars in cash, and created an intricate network of safe houses throughout his tribal homeland. But all his preparations couldn't overcome one fundamental weakness. He had spent decades making enemies of everyone around him. The same paranoia that kept him in power now made it impossible for him to trust anyone with his location. He was reduced to relying on a handful of bodyguards and relatives, moving constantly between hiding spots in the Iraqi countryside. The breakthrough came through patient intelligence work by Staff Sergeant Eric Maddox, who realized that traditional interrogation methods were failing because they focused on Saddam's former government officials, men whose power had depended on the regime that no longer exists. Instead, Maddox targeted Saddam's bodyguards, the only people who still had any reason to protect him. Through a careful web of interrogations, American forces traced Saddam's support network back to Mohammed Abraham Omar al-Muslit, one of his most trusted bodyguards. When Abraham was finally captured in December 2003, he revealed the location of two farmhouses near Ad-Dawar where Saddam was hiding. It was the same area where young Saddam had hidden after his failed assassination attempt in 1959. A poetic return to where his life of violence had begun. On December 13, 2003, Operation Red Dawn converged on a modest farm compound 15 kilometers south of Tikrit, as 600 American soldiers surrounded the area, cutting electricity and sealing all escape routes. The most powerful man in the Middle East was reduced to crouching in a hole barely large enough for one person. The discovery of Saddam's hiding place was almost anticlimactic. After hours of searching, soldiers found a styrofoam cover concealed beneath a worn mat. When they pulled it away, they discovered a vertical shaft leading to an underground chamber so cramped that Saddam couldn't even stand upright. The man who had built some of the most ostentatious palaces in the Middle East was found cowering like a trapped animal. When soldiers heard a cough echoing from the hole, they prepared for a final firefight. Instead, two hands emerged, followed by a bearded, disheveled man who seemed to have aged decades in just 8 months of hiding. "My name is Saddam Hussein," he declared with pathetic dignity. "I'm the president of Iraq and I want to negotiate." But there would be no negotiations. Saddam's capture marked the end of one of the most destructive political careers in modern history. During his interrogation, he maintained his delusions to the end, insisting that he had no connection to 9/11 and no weapons of mass destruction. In a sense, he was telling the truth, but by then, the truth no longer mattered. His trial and execution for the massacre at the jail were almost beside the point. The real judgment had already been rendered by history itself. A leader who rules through fear alone will always find himself isolated when that fear finally breaks down. Saddam's paranoia, which had kept him in power for so long, ultimately sealed his doom. The spider hole became one of the most iconic images of the 21st century, not just as the capture of a dictator, but as a symbol of how even the most seemingly powerful men can be reduced to nothing by their own choices. Saddam Hussein couldn't stay under the radar because he had spent 3 decades making himself the most visible target in the world, alienating every potential ally and creating enemies in every corner of the globe. In the end, the man who had once commanded millions died alone in a gallows, abandoned by a nation that had finally had enough of his tyranny. It was a fitting conclusion to a life defined by violence, betrayal, and the ultimate self-destruction that comes when power becomes an end in itself, rather than a means to serve something greater.